So Vybz Kartel is not well mentally, physically, or financially. How does this affect this decision as to whether there should be a retrial in this case? Stay tuned. So some interesting things happened in the Court of Appeal, which, as you know, is conducting its hearing now as to whether there should be a retrial in the Vybz Kartel case. Now, let's start with the issue of Kartel's health. Attorney Isaac Buchanan spoke to the court about this issue, and this they referred to as the ordeal point. In other words, that having a second trial, ordering a retrial, would be so much of an ordeal to Kartel and his co-accused in this case that it would not be fair. It would not be in the interests of justice for that retrial to happen. So in doing so, Isaac Buchanan started referring to medical reports speaking about Kartel's health. And this was actually kind of funny because he started to talk about the kind of toll that the whole, the 13 years has taken on Kartel. And then he said he wouldn't go into the details of Kartel's medical condition to protect his privacy. So the judge called him on this because she says she doesn't understand how he's saying that when the details of Kartel's medical condition are all over the internet. And, I was kind of laughing here because no disrespect, counsel, absolutely no disrespect. But for real, it's kind of rich to hear talk about privacy when you just have to go on the internet and Google. So for instance, over a year ago in 2023, a New York broadcaster, Lisa Evans, said she had seen the medical report speaking about Kartel's condition and speaking about the fact that he had Graves' disease, which is a disease that affects the thyroid. And Mr. Buchanan himself is quoted in interviews talking about Kartel's heart conditions, saying that his condition is life-threatening, describing some of his physical symptoms, saying, for instance, his face was swollen and that, his eyes were protruding. So again, respectful. It's a little rich to hear, privacy concerns. We're not discussing his medical condition. Anyway, after the judge called him on that, I guess he kind of realized that what she was saying was true. And then he did go on to give some more information. So he spoke, for instance, about that medical report. One of the doctors, Dr. Karen Phillips, and that medical report is dated June 3rd, he said 2024. Of course, the importance of that is to show that the medical conditions he's speaking about are still at this point in time affecting Kartel. It's not something that happened in the past and that perhaps he's recovered from. So he spoke about the issue of the Graves' disease. He spoke about his heart condition, saying that since last year, Kartel has lost 50% of his heart function. He also spoke about mental issues, speaking here now about a separate medical report on his mental health, which a Dr. Walcott had done, showing that he's been suffering from the stresses of this ordeal, that he's been exhibiting symptoms of anxiety. And Mr. Buchanan also said that he was suffering from, I'm using his words here, suffering from a mental weakness brought on by the ordeal. And the point he's making with all of this is that Kartel can't go through another trial. In fact, he said as much. He said the medical opinion is that he would not be able to sustain a second trial. He spoke about his financial issues as well, saying that, he spent so much over the years on this trial, and that, again, it would be a tremendous burden and ordeal for him to have to go through a second trial in circumstances where he was not at fault. Stick a pin here. This is referring, of course, to the fact that the convictions were quashed because the Privy Council said the trial judge, that's a judge who presided over the trial, made an error in allowing the so-called tainted juror to continue on the jury. He was tainted. He's referred to that because he tried to bribe other people on the jury to have them vote not guilty in the matter. It was reported to the judge, and the judge decided to allow the trial to continue. The Privy Council said that was basically a fatal mistake, and that because of that, the convictions were quashed. So back to Mr. Buchanan. So Mr. Buchanan is saying that, hey, none of this was Kartel's fault, and he is now having all these health issues, so it would not be in the interest of justice for him to be forced to undergo a second trial. Interestingly, he was citing from what we call authorities, meaning cases in which the courts have looked at similar issues in the past and have said, made determinations, made rulings. And one of the cases he was citing said that a person should not be made to suffer this kind of ordeal, a retrial, a second time, unless, though, here's the kicker, unless it is in the interest of justice. And I'm going to come back to that. What else happened? Well, one of the other co-accused, Kahira Jones, his lawyer who was addressing the court said, one of the issues that Kahira Jones has been having is that he hasn't been able to have a personal life and an intimate life. Of course, they're talking here about, being able to sustain a personal relationship, have a sex life, those things that go into making a full life, and making the point that he feels that he has lost his prime. He's been in prison for the last 13 years in the prime of his life. And I know a lot of people are paying attention to this point. I would say it's one of the factors that's being put forward. The court then is going to decide how much weight, how much importance they are going to give to this as well as the other factors. What else? The other point I wanted to make that came out in the court today is the issue of publicity. And this has been a big issue in this case. This is a case that everybody has been talking about. Even if you're not into cartel, people have been interested because it involves a big star from the moment of the arrest, all the way through to the trial, through to the various appeals. Of course, when the Privy Council handed down its ruling, that was huge as well. At every stage, there's been massive publicity. Now, years ago, back in the day, if we're talking about publicity, we would have been talking about, traditional media, meaning radio, meaning TV, meaning newspapers. Those kinds of channels of communication can be easily controlled. The judge can issue what's called a gag order, meaning saying, reporters, you can't report on anything on this aspect of the proceedings, or you can't report on X, or you can't report on Y, or in extreme circumstances, they can close the courtroom, lock everybody out. Judges have all kinds of powers to manage trials and proceedings in the interests of justice. I'm saying this to say that one of the arguments that was being made by Attorney John Clark is that publicity was a huge problem here. Remember, I was just telling you about the juror. So this juror in the trial had tried to bribe other members of the jury to have them vote not guilty when they went into the jury room. Now, it has to be said, there was never any link that was shown between this juror, I should say, as well as and the accused men. But when you look at what was out there in the space, meaning in the media space, in the social media space, a lot of people assumed that there was a link. A lot of people assumed that it must have been Kartel and the other men who somehow had some influence or hired this juror or somehow to convince him or to get him to try to bribe the other jurors to try to vote not guilty. So the point Mr. Buchanan was making is that, not Mr. Buchanan, I beg your pardon, it was John Clark making these submissions. The point that John Clark was making is that, look, there was so much publicity after the trial about this issue of the juror, the tainted juror, attempts to bribe the jury, attempts to bribe jurors to come in with a not guilty verdict, that there has been such a negative perception put out in the public space, suggesting lots of people coming to the conclusion without any evidence, without any link being made, that there was a link between this juror and the men. So John Clark was saying it's going to be almost impossible to be able to find a jury now in a retrial, if there's a retrial, that can sit and hear the matter in an unbiased way. So his concern is that all this publicity after the trial has prejudiced the possibility of a fair second trial for the men. And he had this interesting analogy. He said the integrity of the justice system, the integrity of the trial process here was like an egg. And then later on, while he was making his arguments, especially on the publicity point, he said, with all of the issues that have gone wrong, all of these issues that we've been talking about, the egg basically is broken and we cannot now put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I said in the introduction, how does all this affect the case? Of course, that's going to be for the Court of Appeal to decide. Now, there's an important issue that you always have to bear in mind. First of all, we are hearing these arguments that are being made by the lawyers for the defense. They are representing Kartel, Kahira Jones, Andre St. John, and Sean Campbell. They are making their arguments on their behalf. So, of course, they're arguing that it would not be in the interest of justice for there to be a retrial, for there to be a second trial. There is another side that we have not started to hear yet, which is the prosecution side. Remember, at the center of all this is the allegation that a man was murdered in vicious circumstances by these 4 men. So despite everything that the men have been going through, that we've been hearing their lawyers argue, the other side of the coin is that given that there has been this allegation of this vicious murder, is it in the interest of justice, despite what the men have been going through? Would it therefore be in the interest of justice for there to be this second trial so that the society can see that we don't just give up on murder cases, that it is in the interest of the public interest to push this matter all the way through, even if it needs a second trial, even if it means inconvenience and problems to the men who have been accused of this crime. So those are the issues that the Court of Appeal is going to be balancing. And it's going to be up to the court how much, we call it weight, how much importance they give to each of the factors that the men have been putting forward. But as I said, we haven't started yet to hear from the prosecution. The prosecution is going to be starting to make its arguments on day 4. We're going to be hearing them make the argument that it is very much in the interest of justice for this retrial to take place. And we look forward to hearing everything that they're saying. And of course, I'm going to be updating you, bringing you up to date, as well as telling you what I think about some of these issues and just how they are going to weigh in the balance when the Court of Appeal makes its decision.